This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas of all types and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is the chairman of Gesher, an Israeli civil society organization dedicated to building bridges and mending rifts in Israeli society. He also has a soft spot for Israel-diaspora relations, in which capacity he co-directed a research project comparing American Jewish attitudes towards Israel with those prevalent among British Jews. Daniel Goldman, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Good morning.
So there's very little disagreement on the fact that there is a degree of distancing between American Jews and Israel, but the main disagreement is on the reasons for it that range from demographic changes within the Jewish American community to differences on Israeli policy. Can you briefly take us through the debate? And I'd also like to hear which arguments you find more convincing than others.
Sure. So I think the spark for our writing, and I just want to mention that I was really the junior partner with Yossi Shane on this, the head of political science at Tel Aviv University, and we were really just sitting thinking about the debate within America with respect to really the position that I suppose Peter Beinart himself leads and almost exemplifies, which is that it's not that American Jewry has changed, but that Israel changed and shifted. Obviously, it has been more emphasized with the, Netanyahu-led government of the policies that he drives, and that has shifted away from the vision that American Jewry has for Israel as open and liberal and so on and so forth. And that is definitely the more dominant theme that people like Beinart put forward. As an alternative to that, you have the beginnings of a debate, particularly in America, that says, actually, no, it is American Jewry which is shifting, either by perception or in reality, and that's what's driving a wider gap between Israel and American Jewry, where, if you will, they have become more, and when I say assimilated, I don't necessarily mean in the classic meaning of assimilation, but as a society, American Jewry has become more assimilated within the American culture itself, so that American Jews are really American Jews.
And these different takes run along the liberal conservative fault line within the Jewish community? I
would suggest that actually you should probably take out the relatively small percentage of Orthodox and Haredi Jews and Jewish communities in North America, because even within this debate, it's sort of from there and onwards. I don't think there's any real case for saying that the Orthodox, the modern Orthodox, or the Haredi communities in North America are in any way becoming more distant from Israel. In fact, probably the opposite is the case. There's a greater affinity, more family ties, more visits, people coming here to study, kids that live here, and so on and so forth. So the entire debate really is just talking about the liberal end of American Jewry. And probably it is worth, I think, considering that within that you have probably best described as engaged and disengaged. So people sort of debate the numbers, but within the probably 90%, which is non-Orthodox, you probably have 80% of those that are disengaged, which means they don't show up to a JCC, they probably don't show up to a synagogue or a temple anytime. I saw once that the definition of engaged was once a year, a visit to a restaurant inside a JCC, you're in.
Right, okay. So whatever it takes, yeah.
So even if you say that's the engaged, that's still probably about 20%. And then you have 80%, which is disappearing. And then the demographics, again, there are claims and counterclaims. As you go younger in the demographics, then the problem becomes more severe. And I think the challenge that the Jewish community has is there a connection between having them engaged in their Judaism and engaged in Israel? Can I be engaged in Judaism today in North America without being engaged in Israel? How much of my Jewish identity is actually taken up by my relationship with Israel? Open brackets, I would say there's an irony around the fact that Beinart's identity is so much wrapped up with the criticism of Israel, but that expression comes through Haaretz, which is, of course, an Israeli newspaper.
Yeah.
So it's not that he is personally disengaging from Israel, just his reflection and his relationship with Israel is switching from a sort of more from a positive to a more negative
it's
situation.
a question whether loving someone or something is actually is equivalent to liking them.
I would much rather have a Peter Beinart than somebody who didn't care at all.
Right.
Personally speaking, as a citizen of Israel and a member of the Jewish people. And then the question is, well, all the guys who aren't even showing up to complain. And I think that is definitely less about Israel and more about changes in the American Jewish community. And
what are these changes? Where do they come from?
So when some of the things that we sort of point to in the paper, if you reflect on the words of Jack Wertheimer, for example, who really complains effectively that Tikkun Olam, which has become a huge growth engine for American Jewry, has really replaced anything particular about being Jewish. So, for example, you can, as part of your Tikkun Olam, you may volunteer in Africa or go to Haiti in an earthquake or look after African Americans in D.C. or whatever that is. But if something happens to your Jewish colleague in Paris because of anti-Semitism, you may be unlikely to act or respond in that way. So Tikkun Olam has really come to replace an affinity with other parts of the Jewish world, the Jewish diaspora, and of course Israel.
Yeah, so how does that project on Israel? Because they care less about Israel, they care more about international causes than about and specifically Jewish causes, including Israel.
The observation around the Tikkun Olam as an example is it's the passport that those American Jews are using to enter American society. So that has now become as much part of their American Tudat Zahut, if you will, as it is their Jewish Tudat Zahut, or what sometimes seems to me is it's actually becoming the same thing. Their religion has moved from being Judaism to American Jewish.
So basically it's conceptual assimilation, if you like. It's not just marrying out or anything, but it's actually
Which is why it
more,
feels like assimilation without it actually being assimilation necessarily. You can be married to a Jewish person and have Jewish parents and maybe Jewish kids and so on and so forth, but in reality, if you're Seinfeld making jokes in Hollywood or in New York, what's Jewish about that really other than Kugel and making funny jokes about Jews?
Yeah. All right. So that's America. And also, as our listeners might have gathered by now, your field of expertise is British Jewry, which on the surface could be a good case study because it is a rather sizable English-speaking community, Jewish community, but the differences sometimes outweigh the similarities.
Absolutely. And I think even as a precursor to that, when the debate in Israel is about Israel diaspora relations, what most people are really talking about is Israel-American Jewry relations. And so what we really wanted to throw up was the idea there are other Jewish communities around the world. They have different challenges, different successes. The bedrock of the society within which they live is different to America, and therefore their response to being Jewish in that environment is different, and that has a reflection then on how they relate to Israel. And I think we need to break away a little bit from the constant debate just around Israel and America, as we do with political and geopolitical things. There are other, Europe is important, Asia is important. So yes, the Jewish community in the UK for us was an obvious one to look at because it's Anglo-Saxon, it's a liberal society, it's based on democratic principles. So, okay, that's all the same.
And it's pretty big and diverse also.
It is, but of course, you got 5 million plus Jews in North America and 300,000 in the UK. You can't run away from the North American thing, but you can't afford to be dominated by that. Mm-hmm. So when we looked at the things which were similar, different, I think the things which came out really strongly, number one, I think you have to reflect on a different atmosphere for anti-Semitism. And we're sitting now a week after the election, and who knows what that is in America, of course. Who knows? I don't think we're in the business of making hyper comments about anything, but I think we have an open question of what that campaign may have unleashed. But pre that, I think there's a very different history of anti-Semitism in Britain and Europe relative to America, and that obviously changes the psyche and the DNA of the Jewish community and the Jewish reaction to that in both places. Mm-hmm. So that's one aspect. I think the second aspect, a very big one, is relates to leadership. So ironically, because in America there is no state religion, therefore the state does not actually have formal relations with any religion, whereas in the UK you have, even though it's becoming weaker and weaker, you have established church and the Queen is the head of the Church of England. For the last several hundred years, the state, the government, the Queen, has formal relations with other religions. So there is a Board of Deputies in the UK, which is a democratically elected body of Jews representing synagogues and organizations that was actually formed 250 years ago by King whoever, and that has standing. And within that body, you have a complete diversity of all the Jewish communities of the UK. Mm-hmm. Such a body does not exist in the United States.
Yeah, but wouldn't you say that other than the official status, it's pretty much similar to what we call the Jewish establishment in the United States?
Absolutely not. In the UK, you have one or maybe two, maximum three people that speak for officially or even unofficially for the total body of the Jewish communities in the national press, to the government, and as a sort of external communicators. You have one chief rabbi that broadly represents, again, not getting it, if we had the time we could talk about who he doesn't represent, but broadly represents all the Jewish communities of the UK. And when the BBC wants to speak to a rabbi, that's who they're going to call up. Mm-hmm. There aren't, in America you have the head of the Reform Shul and you have the conservatives and the Orthodox, and there is no one rabbi or even one rabbinic body. And you have Orthodox and Haredi and RCA and OU, and everybody is vying. By the way, of course, they all have offices, lobbying offices in Washington. Mm-hmm. In the UK, the leadership is more consolidated, which means that the Jewish community acts in a more unified capacity than it does in North America.
So does it really affect the diversity of opinions and the diversity of the debate within the respective Jewish communities? Is the Jewish community in Britain less liberal, as it were, in this sense than America?
Terrific question. I think one more point about the infrastructure of the community,
sure,
and then we can relate it. But it's a good segue into the debate. We talked about American Jewry, where, forget the exact numbers, but say 10% Orthodox, the rest is liberal Jewry, conservative, Reform, etc. It's more, not exactly, but it's more or less upturned in Britain, where you have probably at least 75%, which is Orthodox affiliated, even if not necessarily Orthodox by behavior. Within that, obviously, you have fully Orthodox and Haredi, and probably 20-25%, which is conservative and Reform. So the dominant stream in the UK is Orthodoxy, and the dominant stream, obviously, in North America is non-Orthodoxy. Yeah. So that already narrows to a certain degree the diversity of those opinions.
Sure. That's the Marxist base that leads to the superstructure, which is the attitude towards Israel, perhaps.
Exactly. Now, that is not to say that you don't have right and left and you don't have diversity of opinion with respect to Israel, and you have people who are, pro-settlement and anti-settlement and pro this or that. But I think what the intimacy of the community itself, and we do talk about this as well in the paper, the fact that everybody lives much closer together. There are really only two major population centers for the Jewish communities, London and Manchester, with very small provincial communities outside. When everybody is in the same room, even if we're going to have different opinions, the ability to drive that out to the margins and the edges becomes much more difficult. Once you've maintained the debate within a single room, even if there's going to be a diversity of opinions, they're going to be less extreme. I continue to sit with my brother on the other side of the room, even if he's more left-wing or right-wing than I, and therefore you're less likely to see a more exaggerated diversity of those opinions in the British community.
Mm-hmm. But that perhaps defies one of the main tenets of Judaism everywhere, and in America as well, which is, it's one tribe. We are all one big family. However we look at it, whatever our perceptions on X, Y, and Z are, is it not really what it used to be like in America and is gradually eroding?
So, first of all, I think we're 12 tribes, not one tribe.
Right, okay.
And actually, I think that's really an important
point taken.
That's a really crucial point. I think the mosaic of those tribes with different opinions, different roles, more radical, more progressive, more conservative, less conservative, that's how we then drive forward the ideas of the people. So I think the diversity is crucial.
Okay, my point is, say 50 years ago, wasn't the Jewish American community much more uniform than it is today?
Wow. So it depends how far you want to go back in time and look at that from a historic perspective. I just suggest something. I'm not going to make a dramatic claim, but if you look at American Jewry pre-Holocaust, fundamentally speaking, the liberal aspects of that, they may have been pro-Israel in a sort of solidarity aspect of it. Okay, there are Jews in Israel, we should look out for them. But I don't think there was any sense of any vibrant Zionism around that community. And in fact, if you go back 100 years, and we're coming to it in the coming year, Balfour, when Balfour was being suggested in the Balfour Direction was happening in the UK, the Zionist movement was very much the minority movement in the UK. So there have been massive shifts in terms of, if you sort of consider that as a proxy for the relationship with Israel. Obviously very hard to do that when there was no Israel 100 years ago, but the idea of a nation state, a sovereignty for Jews in the Middle East, I think there have been huge shifts. Clearly, the Holocaust comes along. First of all, it takes off the table outspoken anti-Semitism within both British and American society. Question with Corbyn in the UK and Steve Bannon, say, in the US, whether certain demons are being unleashed and people should be nervous about that. I don't know. But I think the other thing is, as we distance ourselves, particularly with respect to American Jewry, from the experiences of the Holocaust and the need for the shelter that Israel created for European Jewry, plus the, I think, breaking of the fantasy that Israel is in some way a reflection of this almost idealized liberal progressive society, which doesn't frankly exist in America either, except in the places that voted for Hillary, perhaps. As you move away from that fantasy, you probably have a reversion to a default rather than, the Jews in America always loved Israel. I think that's only taking history back to a certain degree. So I think the shift in attitudes that is happening with American Jewry towards Israel, which we talked about before, the disengagement, you may want to think of it more as a reversion to norm and less about some kind of radical shift to a new paradigm of thinking. Yep. It may affect your thinking as to how to sort of deal with that or work with that challenge, but I think it's important to understand where that sits on the sort of historic line of the development of those relations.
Mm-hmm. I want to go back to anti-Semitism, as one does.
Please.
You said that it's a lot more palpable in the British Jewish British state of mind than it is in America. Now, we did discuss the recent developments, both in America with the election of Donald Trump and in the UK with the election of Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party, the opposition party. But if we go back, a few years before to the several decades after the Holocaust, when you said that anti-Semitism was put back in the closet, was it still on the minds of British Jews to the extent that it was really defining their Judaism, which, if I understand it correctly, wasn't the same in America? Was anti-Semitism really a central tenet of being Jewish in Britain?
I think there is a important distinction at sort of, if you could measure complacency. So I think American Jewry as a whole has a fairly reasonable complacency around anti-Semitism within American society, and that's actually, I think, fairly reasonable. I'm not saying they shouldn't have that, and I don't believe in you have to live your life paranoid about things which are going to happen. Whether or not you see that undercurrent of concern within British society, I think it depends on the cycle that society is in at that given moment. And whilst there have always been reflections of that anti-Semitism, sometimes at a political level or an institutional level, etc., I think there is a deeper idea to be considered, which is that whilst, let's say, over the last 100 years, Jews could be central figures and be, leading figures within the British judiciary or government or business and so on and so forth, very often that would not come with an outspoken expression of their Jewish identity. Mm-hmm. Whereas in America, you would celebrate the fact that he's a judge and Jewish, American Jewish. There isn't so much British Jewish in that sense. Yeah. Not that they're ashamed of their own Judaism, but it's something which I keep at home. It's something which I keep
And that
more
is because
closeted.
of anti-Semitism or the looming threat of anti-Semitism?
I think it's, again, the bedrock of British liberalism is based around you have Christian society and Jews. You have 1,000 years of different types of and expressions of anti-Semitism going all the way back to York and blood libels and so forth. Yeah. Somewhere deep in the psyche, it sits.
It's there.
Yeah, different people react to it in different ways. There is no such history for American Jewry, and just the opposite. Americanism is almost a kind of messianism away from those types of prejudices, and it's supposed to be the much more open and, bring us your poor and bring us your everybody, and you're all going to be welcome and integrated into American society.
All right. So basically, the British model refutes, in a sense, Peter Beinart's take, because it's not about Israel. If it was really the way Israel conducts itself, there would be a similar backlash among all Jewish communities all around the world. And if the difference in opinion, the evolution of the attitudes towards Israel has been a lot smaller than in America, then it's really all about demographics and really not about Israel.
I would completely agree with you.
All right. Okay. Take heed, Peter Beinart. You're talking bollocks. All right. And on this note, I'd like to thank Daniel Goldman, the chairman of Gesher, an Israeli civil society organization dedicated to building bridges and mending rifts in Israeli society, and also an expert of sorts on Israel diaspora relations. Thank you very much for coming in today.
My absolute pleasure.
And also big thanks to Tammy Goldenberg, the sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. Also, check out our new website, telavivreview.org, and like us on Facebook. You can also follow me on Twitter at Gilad_Halpern. I tweet mainly about review, and don't hesitate to get in touch with your comments and suggestions. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.
אהבה לא גדלה על עצים, את יודעת, היא צומחת לאט בנתיבים המהירים של הלב. אז שמרי על עצמך, אז שמרי, את נוסעת בדרך המלך למחוזות הכאב.